What is most important to understand about this speech that we will hear played, certainly, as we lead up to this march on Washington? What do we not know about the context of this speech?
Well, I guess the first thing to know is that it wasn't as though most Americans at that time were in love with this speech, or even the March on Washington. That the March on Washington poll show was not a popular thing to be doing. Most white Americans certainly believed that the push to civil rights was moving too fast. And in that moment, civil rights as a concept, integration as a concept, was still somewhat controversial, and how America got there was not a foregone conclusion. And I think today, the way the speech of the march is understood, it's wrapped in the flag and seen as one more example of American genius, when in fact it was a mass, multiracial, dissident act. And just a couple of examples of things that took place around that time to show that people really, powers that be, really didn't want this to happen. Kennedy tried to talk them out of the march. The march was policed like a military operation. Literally, it was called Operation Steep Hill, and they had boxcars and helicopters ready to go. They stopped all elective surgery in Washington that weekend. They stopped the sale of alcohol, no baseball games, and said that the courts were going to run all night, thinking that there would be a large number of arrests, which there weren't. But also, quite funnily, on the day, the sound system had been tampered with by the Justice Department and had put a kill switch because they feared that someone would take to the mic and call for mass insurrection, clearly not really listening to anything that the civil rights leaders had been saying over the previous year. And if that were to take place, then the plan was to effect the kill switch, kill the mic, and play a record of Mahalia Jackson singing "He's Got the Whole World in His Hands."
Well, and Gary Younge, in that context, Martin Luther King wasn't even a headline speaker at the event, was he? He wasn't like the main draw. Could you talk about how his speech evolved then to become this iconic pronouncement of the civil rights movement?
Well, yeah, it's intriguing. I mean, King is the last speaker, and so to that extent, one can say he's the keynote. But that he delivers this speech. Anybody who knew King well, who had seen him speak many times, you ask any of them, so did you think we would be talking about this speech in 50 years' time? And they say, really, no. I mean, it was a great speech, but great speeches was what he did. But here's what I argue in the book, and here's what I believe. I think there are two reasons why this speech became iconic. The first is that after '63, King gets the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the Man of the Year on time, I think. But then his star begins to wane as he starts talking about class and poverty and government intervention to address issues of poverty. People say, you know, you're stepping off the reservation here. You stick to what you know, which is race and civil rights. Then he starts to talk about Vietnam, and he opposes the Vietnam War. And after that, everything really gets tough for him. His unfavorability ratings, twice as many Americans have an unfavorable view of him than a favorable one. And if you think of how favorable African Americans viewed him, then that's a whole lot of white people at that time that really think he's not a great guy. And then he's assassinated. Well, how do we remember this man then? And they did try to forget him, but they can't forget him. So how do we remember him? Well, we can't remember him as the man, nationally, as a national figure. He can't be remembered as the man who said that America was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, because arguably America still is, and that issue has not been resolved. They can't remember him as the man who railed against poverty and for further government intervention, because we're still having that argument. So that none of those things raise him above the fray. They actually insert him into it. But they can remember him as the man who gave the most eloquent articulation of this superb moral moment in America's history. I argue the last great moral act that America has achieved, for which there's still a consensus, which is the end of segregation. And the end of segregation This is the speech. It's not the speech that ends segregation, but as Andrew Young said when I interviewed him for the book, he said, imagine somebody got up in Egypt a couple of years ago and managed in a 15-minute speech to articulate what the Arab Spring was all about. Americans didn't understand it. King explained it, and we have it to listen to, and that's really part of its power. I think the other thing that it does is there is enough in the speech for everybody. It's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. It starts in the shadow of Lincoln and ends with a Negro spiritual and pays homage to the Founding Fathers and the Constitution. You don't get much more patriotic than that if patriotism is what you're after. It's delivered in the black vernacular on this brilliant day at the March in Washington. Progressives love it. And conservatives usually take one line. That my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, by the content of their character, and they use that one line. I've seen Glenn Beck do it, Ronald Reagan do it, opponents of affirmative action do it. They take that one line to say, here you go. Let's ignore the legacy of racism, let's pretend to be colorblind, and let's assume that racism is over. That the way to understand racism is to ignore its legacy. So depending on what you want to misunderstand or understand, there is something in that speech for everybody.
Gary, when he turned to his advisors the night before in Washington to get, suggestions on what to talk about, isn't it true that Wyatt Walker, one of his closest advisors, said, don't talk about the dream, Martin?
That's right. The night before this, the dream segment is not in the text of the speech. The night before, he's casting around looking for ideas, and Wyatt T. Walker, one of his main aides, says, don't do the I have a dream thing. It's trite. It's cliche. You've used it many times before. And King was aiming for a Gettysburg-type address, and he had indeed used the speech, that refrain many times before. That year alone, he had delivered 350 speeches, or around that. He's not delivering a new speech each time. And he's a preacher. Clarence Jones, when I interviewed him, he said he had this ability to cut and paste even as he's speaking, and in the American Baptist tradition, to draw on the mood and the response of the crowd, and that's what he's doing. So he ums and ahs about whether he's going to put it in, and he decides to leave it out. It's not in the text. When he gets to the podium, for the most part, he's quite faithful to the text. And if you listen to the speech, and I think it's the most loved, least well-known speech that I can think of. So most people, when they say they love it, but they've rarely listened to it. And I advise your viewers and listeners, just take 15 minutes out of your life in the next 4 or 5 days and give the speech a listen. If you listen to the speech, he's winding down. Go back to Mississippi, go back to South Carolina. And behind him is Mahalia Jackson, his favorite gospel singer. He used to call Mahalia Jackson when he was down and on the road and ask her to sing to him. So they had a very intimate connection. And Mahalia Jackson shouts, tell him about the dream, Martin, because she had heard him give that speech in Detroit a few months earlier. King continues. Mahalia Jackson shouts again, tell him about the dream. And then just about that time, King, in the words of Clarence Jones, he puts the text to his left, and Clarence Jones says in his body language he shifted from a lecturer to a preacher. And then Jones turned to the person standing next to him and said, those people don't know it, but they're about to go to church. And then King starts on his I have a dream refrain. Now, we don't know for sure whether King heard Mahalia Jackson. Now, Clarence Jones said he must have done because he heard him and he was 20 feet from both of them. King's never said that he did, but we do know that she said it, and we do know that around the time that she said it, that is the direction that he took the speech. And it's within the tradition of the Baptist Church, a sermon or a speech is crafted, it's drafted by the preacher, but then it's crafted as you go along in response, call and response to the crowd. And this was definitely not in the words that was written before him at the time.